So there I was, correct with this particular prediction. And why I was correct is for the simple fact that I was just really calling it exactly as how I'm observing it, right? Obviously, Nate Diaz is a bit of the older fighter. And as I had mentioned in the prediction show for this particular fight with Jake and Nate, is that not all 38-year-olds or people that are in their mid 40s are created equal. Now, given the credit to Nate, you got to understand Nate came in here tonight to do exactly what Nate Diaz does, which is what? Absolutely entertain the crowd. And then on top of that, how about the symbolic nature of the fact that Nate Diaz was able to slap on a guillotine choke right in the middle of the fight while they were clenched up, almost as like a dig of saying, hey, you remember what I did to that guy that was the fake Logan Paul lookalike? And how about Logan Paul flying in 2 hours away from Detroit all the way down to Dallas just so he can watch his brother fight while he came out of a victory in SummerSlam tonight at a WWE show. So that right there is a different accomplishment and a different accolade in and of itself, right? Two brothers that are taking over combat sports in two different realms. And with Nate Diaz, he's the king of moral victories. That's the best way to really understand and describe Nate Diaz. Well, why is that, right? Well, you got to understand. He did this with Leon Edwards. For example, Leon Edwards was battering him, showing him that he was the more skillful man, the much more well-rounded fighter. But then lo and behold, what does Nate Diaz do in the fifth and final round of a championship bout? Not a championship bout, but championship rounds that they were fighting, which is 5 rounds as it would be 12 in boxing. Tonight, it was 10 rounds. And what did he do in the end of the round? Exactly what he did with Leon Edwards. He rocks him and then gets the moral victory. That's everything that we expect out of Nate. And of course, I was correct about the fact that Jake was just more of the explosive man. Jake was more of the athletic person in terms of being able to implement his raw power and his sense of trying to kill this guy, right? Basically, what I mean by kill, I mean in the metaphorical sense of trying to finish off your opponent. Nate Diaz did not look like he was able to hurt Jake anywhere near in the fight at all. It was just like every time Jake threw, you can see that explosive athletic prowess that he had that I had mentioned in the preview to this fight. I had mentioned that Nate Diaz was a little bit slower because he was a lot more methodical in the way that he it was going to move, but just by the nature of his athletic background and foundation. What I mean by that, look, Sean Porter in the commentary during the fight, he mentioned something to the effect of, you know what, I've heard about Nate Diaz's legendary cardio, but I never really understood until now because in the later rounds, whether it was the seventh, eighth, or 10th round, Nate Diaz was coming alive. And that speaks to the athletic foundation that he has, which is what? He's a triathlon athlete. By the way, full context and full disclosure, his brother went and swam El-Kheer. So you have to take into consideration what kind of cardio these guys have. And then they do triathlons on top of that. But here's the thing. Triathlons are not a 25-minute fight or a 36-minute championship boxing fight in terms of giving it your all within this small circumference of time. When we're talking about training for a marathon, we're talking about training for a 26-mile run. And when you're talking about a triathlon, what is the shortest triathlon there is out there? Okay, let's say there's the running portion, there's the swimming portion, and then there's the bike portion. The bike portion is somewhere around, and I'm talking about like the tier, the lowest tier of triathlons, right? Which is 7 miles with running and then 14 miles with the bike. And then on top of that, you have like a 1 mile or 2 mile swim. And then the other Ironman portions of, let's say, triathlons have something along the lines of, let's say, 22 miles or 3 miles of swimming or this and that. These other extreme things. Nonetheless, this is what the Diaz brothers engage in. And they train this for MMA, but then you got to think, is it really conducive for MMA? And why am I mentioning that? Well, because obviously Diaz came a lot more alive later on in the rounds, and it didn't really matter because he was not explosive and was not first head on in the beginning of the fight and in the beginning of the rounds. And I'm talking about half of the fight from round 1 to round 5. He just was not investing in those. You look at Jake Paul, he was investing in the temple shots. He was investing in going to the body. Nate Diaz was just trying to go forward and never really was a threat in any kind of way because he just did not have that kind of power. Now, usually, if you're fighting the older guy, the one thing that most older guys have over you, and you can reference this all the way back to George Foreman, is guess what? They have the strength advantage over you to knock you out and just lay you out with a single shot. George Foreman is that example. Bernard Hopkins, not so much in his later age because he had to use a lot of technicality in order for him to survive and win. Who else used a lot of strength in their older days? Let's see. Fedor, you could say that, yeah. Rampage, for sure, you could say that. Francis Ngannou in the current time right now, he's 36 years old, about to be 37 by the time he starts really hitting his PFL contract and all the fights that he's going to be in for that organization. So, yeah, man, that's the one thing you got to understand about the Diaz brothers. They came alive later in the fight when it's a little bit too late because they're fighting with a marathon and a triathlon pace when in reality, MMA is not a sprint so much, but it's more like a 400-meter sprint, right? There's shorter sprints. There's sprints where you do, like, let's say 50 yards, a half of a football field, half of a soccer field, or something along those lines. Yeah, that's one thing, right? But the other side of that is a little bit longer of a sprint. So you're talking about, like, let's say a half of a track, right? Because a track in and of itself, let's say maybe if you do like 3 laps in a track, you're doing like 1 mile or 1.5 mile. So you're probably doing like a entire full track of sprint. That's what MMA is in a nutshell, right? So you're dealing with a different speed. You have to be first, you have to be explosive, and you have to be stronger than the other guy in order for you to dominate in the way that you want to. And again, that all goes into the kind of training that you do, the kind of foundation that you have, and the kind of habits that you have as an athlete and as a fighter. And what we've seen tonight was, for one of the reasons why Nate Diaz would never really worked out in the highest levels of mixed martial arts of the UFC, right? He was always coming up short. Obviously, he had that one title shot with Benson Henderson back in 2012, and then that was just about it. He was never really the top guy of the organization in the UFC up until he fought Conor. And prior to that, he fought Michael Johnson. And then he was upset that Conor McGregor, and to his credit, maybe there's something right about what Nate Diaz is saying in here. Conor is saying all these crazy things in the same similar fashion that Diaz has, but yet it is Nate Diaz who's getting fined, who's getting shunned, who's not getting any camera time, who's not getting the promotion from the organization. And they go and promote Conor. And then what does he do? He goes and calls Conor out, gets an upset, which at the time Conor was undefeated in the UFC, obviously being the featherweight champ, moving up 2 weight classes to fight Nate Diaz at a short notice, in which he was going to fight Rafael Dos Anjos, who, by the way, is fighting next week against Luque Vicente at 170. But nonetheless, I know I'm jumping around, but just, have a lot of information I want to give out there. But that's when Nate Diaz started becoming really famous and started becoming really known, was in that particular time frame of when he beat Conor McGregor. And then it was just off to the rocket ships from there, right? He went into a different stratosphere of superstardom, but he was never the top guy ever. And you got to take into consideration he beat a Conor McGregor that was two weight classes below him moving up, and Conor didn't have to take that fight. But then in a rematch, you saw that obviously there were the vulnerabilities of Nate Diaz, in which a person that is striker orientated in having a clean defense will always be able to hit Nate Diaz. That's one thing you always have to take into consideration. You've seen that in the Conor fight with Nate Diaz. You've seen that in the Leon Edwards fight with Nate Diaz. He's hittable. And as long as he's hittable, these are the results that you're going to get. But at the same time, as long as Nate Diaz is a triathlon athlete, he's always going to come back at the later rounds in which his opponent is just going to get tired, eventually beating the living S out of him. Because you got to think, for most average people who don't have the durability that Nate Diaz has, if you take a shot like that from Jake Paul or from Leon Edwards or Conor McGregor, they're going to lay out the majority of the fighters in the world, if not the people that they're going to face, right? Even at the highest level, but most high level people just not so much. But why with Nate Diaz? Well, because Nate Diaz just has that durability that's just going to make him very tough to finish, which is going to make you tired, and then it's going to build lactic acid in your particular um in in your particular muscles that you're trying to push as the fight goes on. Shout outs to Zane Heavy Boxing Dosage. That fight was lit, bro. Nate surprised me. That's what I'm saying. He surprised me, but at the same time he didn't. And this is why I called this fight to be a decision, Zane, was because yes, Nate Diaz was going to be durable, and Nate Diaz was always going to come back. And this is what he did. I urge you to watch the Leon Edwards fight. I know that's a mixed martial arts fight. I don't know how much you can really draw from that going into trying to understand this Paul boxing match, but it showed that Nate Diaz is just not going to go down easily. But at the same time, he's not going to be the one doing the finish. He's not the one that's going to do Francis Ngannou knockouts where he uppercuts you from, the third row. He's not going to do Deontay Wilder knockouts or Gervonta Davis knockouts or Robbie Lawler knockouts or anything like that. He's not that kind of guy. But what he is a guy that can just continue punching and punching, maybe at a slow rate, but eventually that slow rate goes and catches up to you. And then sometimes you just became too late. And once again, I think one of the reasons why you were surprised, Zane, is because of the fact that um he made Jake Paul look tired. But of course you're going to look tired if you're just constantly, hitting someone in their face. Yes, it's damaging them, but still it's taking an impact and a toll in your lactic acid muscles as you're going through the motions of the fight. So once again, this is Nate Diaz in a nutshell, right? He comes out and he's like the perfect journeyman, right? For all the boxing guys that understand the business of journeyman and this and that, would you consider Nate Diaz sort of like that in the boxing world? Would you consider him a journeyman? Let's okay. Let's try to take a look at this, right? How would he do against somebody like, let's say, Gabriel Rosado? How would he do against someone like that? I think the majority of the boxing guys would say, yeah, Gabe got that. That's easy work. Okay, let's go down the list. How about Dan Aziz? Maybe a little too big, but you got to take into consideration Nate Diaz fought at 185 tonight, which, by the way, was probably one of his career heaviest. If you guys want context on the boxing side, what kind of weight class Nate Diaz usually fought at, I want you guys to think of Charlo, the undisputed 154 champion, right? That's literally what he normally fights at. Now, this 185 in MMA, 185 is a real particular weight class, and that would be considered the middleweight division in MMA and in particular the UFC. But obviously, they considered this the limit of a cruiserweight fight because at one point, I believe cruiserweight was at 190 and they moved it up to 200, right? So you could sort of consider this a junior cruiserweight bout of some sort, or a catch weight, or in MMA terms, a middleweight. Obviously, middleweight is 160, 168, super middleweight in boxing. But yeah, so on and so forth. That's the differences of weight classes in this particular matter. Now, you speaking of weight classes, I think that Jake Paul has um real good muscle foundations to fight in this particular weight class, whereas Nate Diaz was just coming in here not really cutting weight at all. I guess maybe you could say he was just walking around his normal walk around weight, or maybe he does get a little bit heavier than this, but maybe not so much more than anywhere close to maybe 190. Maybe he doesn't go over 200. I mean, for goodness sakes, Patty the Batty fights at 155, but he bumps up to 210 when he's in his off seasons, and he takes a long break in between. So I guess he has some sort of time for him to be able to cut all that weight in between that. But once again, going back to Nate Diaz, what really surprised us the most, or what didn't really surprise us the most with Nate Diaz, is the fact that he's durable, the fact that he trash talks, which makes all of this entertaining. And by the way, if you guys didn't hear in the beginning of this podcast, or this particular review show for that matter, I had mentioned that Nate Diaz put Jake in a guillotine, right? Almost as a way to simulate what he did in that New Orleans street fight. I got to tell you, when that thing went down with the fake Logan Paul, as they like to call him, the guy that Nate got into a street fight with and choked him out and dropped him on the ground, I thought for sure that the fight was going to end, right? Because I got to tell you guys, in the United States, yes, there's a lot of tough guys here. Yes, there's a lot of gang banging going on, especially if you go to the West Coast, or if you go to the East Coast, or if you go down south, or this and that. There's a lot of that going on, right? But the one thing that you can count on in the United States is that, especially if you're in a tourist area, you're dealing with the rule of law to the highest degree. Why? Because they want to keep that place safe. They want to keep the revenues coming. They want tourists to come in feeling safe. And if you do anything to mess that up, then the law of the land is going to lay some heavy fines, heavy sanctions, heavy arrests, heavy indictments against you, all types of things, right? So with that in mind, you got to understand, um, in this kind of situation with Paul and Diaz, right? Um, Diaz got into this street fight because this is just what they do, okay? But once again, a lot of people sue in the United States, regardless of all these things that I had just mentioned, regardless of the fact that there's gang banging going on, regardless of the fact that people fight like any other place in the world where there's bars and pubs and restaurants and places that people hang out and all these social settings. Yes, people get into street fights, but the problem is people get sued. And I always wondered what happened with this entire case. Like, how come Nate Diaz was able to pull through with this and not get in trouble? Did they have to pay somebody off in order for this to go away? Because, I mean, look, nowadays you can't just really street fight anybody out in the streets and get away with it. But kudos to Nate. He was able to fight that. Or maybe he just has a case going on that we don't know about. And maybe it's just not that public. Or maybe their public relations team is somehow really cracking down on it and saying, you know what? Maybe we got to crack down on this and not let people know there's a court date going on, or there's a settlement that maybe we have came to a conclusion to. Because you got to think, this particular fight with Nate Diaz, he got paid a lot of money, I would assume, maybe a little bit more than the UFC for him to fight Jake Paul. And perhaps maybe some of that money went into settlements of some sort. But nonetheless, right? Great that he never really got in trouble for that particular fight. And by the way, him putting that guy in a guillotine was just Nate Diaz's classic promotional skills in the particular settings of when the fight is going on, not outside or in press conferences or this and that, because this is what Jake Paul was really complaining about in the beginning of this particular fight that they signed for, right? He just wasn't out there talking trash, was not out there putting himself out there, was not really um making a fiasco of anything, reacting emotionally or doing Nate Diaz things, right? Flipping off the middle finger or this and that. There wasn't really any of that going on. And why? Because you got to understand, Jake Paul has bombed one of his pay-per-views before with Anderson Silva. And why is that significant to mention? Well, because you got to think, okay, Anderson Silva, yes, MMA legend. Everybody knows him. 12 title defenses in a row, has broken a lot of records in the UFC for the past decade and the previous decade, and was one of the greatest fighters of all time in the UFC, blah, 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 this and that. And now he's boxing Jake Paul. Okay. But it was in the middle of February, maybe somewhere around the Super Bowl. So, of course, the Anderson Silva, Jake Paul pay per view bombed because of that. So now he has this opportunity to fight Nate Diaz after he fought in Saudi Arabia in his lackluster loss against Tommy Fury. So maybe he didn't really care too much about the pay-per-views that he was going to do at the Saudi show with Tommy Fury. Of course not, because the Saudis were going to pay for everything. They have this grand scheme of creating some sort of tourist brand for Saudi Arabia in terms of having all these sporting events. That's what was in it for them. So there was no pressure on the fighters to somehow create some kind of pay-per-view buzz for it. Now, with this particular Diaz card, he had to do that. Maybe he felt pressured and, hey, you know what? These previous pay-per-views bombed, so we got to do something. We have to do something different. We got to get Diaz to get wild up. And then in Diaz's mind, he's not thinking about any of that. He's just thinking, you know what? I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to fight and I'm going to do my thing, and that's that. But lo and behold, if you watch this fight and you spent your $59 to watch this event, I tell you what, you got your money's worth. Why? Because Nate Diaz did Nate Diaz things. Look, Nate Diaz, I got to tell you, he's a combination of Tupac Shakur and Stone Cold Steve Austin. And I know I'm probably going down a Tupac Shakur rabbit hole because of this research that I had to do for the particular podcast that I wanted to do about Mayweather and him witnessing it, and then all this other stuff that I had learned about all these different characters that were involved in this and that. And then somehow it's all correlated to the fact that Nate Diaz walks out to a lot of Tupac Shakur songs. He's walked out to songs like Ballad of a Dead Soldier. He's walked out to You Can't See Me. He's walked out to Ambitions of a Rider. Just like a lot of other fighters. I mean, Tupac is probably one of the most walked out songs in all of mixed martial arts. George St. Pierre walked out to Ambitions as a Rider when he fought Frank Trigg. And then, of course, he came out with the whole karate gear and a karate gi on top of that, too, when he did that. But nonetheless, Tupac is one of the most played artists of all combat sports. And then not just that, Nate Diaz embodies Tupac in that kind of way, that F you attitude. I don't really care about playing by the rules. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to smoke some bud, and I'm not going to care about what others think. I'm going to do what I feel is right. I'm not going to go to any press conferences if I don't want to. I'm not going to play the game. That's literally his brand. He didn't play the game outside of the ring or outside of the promotion. But when he got in that ring, he did exactly that. He was putting his hands down. He was pretending like he was walking away, which I thought was maybe a sense of a defensive mechanism, as to say, nah, you're not really hurting me. This fight ain't S. You know what I mean? I'm not going to react to any of the shots that you're giving me or this and that. Like, Nate Diaz was sort of playing possum, but at the same time, he was also trying to put on his poker face as all of this was going on. So, yeah, man, Nate Diaz really came through with the entertainment factor in that. But make no mistake, as a boxer and as an MMA fighter, Nate Diaz is exactly what Nate Diaz is. And what exactly is that? Well, Nate Diaz is an entertaining fighter that just can't reach at the highest level. Just like tonight with the Sandhagen and Font card, right? Here we have Sandhagen, who's number 4 in the world, arguably probably even higher that because of the fact that all these guys are just in such close knit matchups in the 135 division of the UFC. And then here comes Rob Font, who's number 7. I mean, just the way that Sandhagen had out-grappled him the entire night, by the way, transitioning flying knees and into shooting double leg takedowns, and then just being able to keep him down on the ground, and just his ground control, and just creating different wrinkles in Sandhagen's game is just remarkable, right? Because it really showed the difference in the separation of levels. Obviously, we're talking about two guys that are in the top 10, but there is a difference between guys that are in the top 5 and guys that are in the top 10. Just like there's a difference between guys that are in the top 10 and guys at the top 15 and guys that are just trying to break below that ceiling, right? That's just what we saw tonight. Now, with Nate Diaz in his UFC career, and you love how I'm going back and forth with this, right? I'm talking about MMA, the fight that happened tonight, while I'm talking about Nate Diaz's career, and then trying to correlate that all together. All these other channels, what they do is they talk about random things, and I do that as well, but I try to correlate them. Okay, so back to Nate Diaz's MMA career. Nate Diaz's MMA career was mediocre at best, to be quite honest with you, right? Why is that? Well, he had a chance to fight a lot of the top names, a lot of the world level, a lot of the top 5, and a lot of the champions out there. And why is it that he came short every time? Because I got to tell you guys, it all goes down with the training. Remember, I told you in a prediction video that one of the problems that Nate Diaz had was that he just did not work on explosion. He did not work on trying to manipulate his nerves into dire situations of just trying to move with a sense of urgency. He just doesn't have that. You've seen even in the first round of this fight with Jake Paul, what did his corner tell him? He said, "Hey, Nate, you're kind of fighting a little bit too relaxed." Okay, and here's the thing. Fighting relaxed is a gift and a curse. Okay, because you know what relax can get you? It can get you a Ben Askren and a Jorge Masvidal situation, just like a Ben Askren and Jake Paul boxing situation. And what do those two Ben Askren fights have in common, both in his MMA fight with Jorge Masvidal and his boxing match with Jake Paul? Well, the correlation of that was he was way too relaxed. Within that first 5 seconds, Jorge Masvidal was controlling the tempo of his speed, looking like he was going to be slow, trying to look like he wasn't a real threat of any sort. And then lo and behold, he goes and cuts an angle, runs to the other side into the middle of where Ben Askren was going to shoot for a double leg, and then lands a 5-second knockout against Ben Askren, and out he goes. And then the same thing with the boxing match with Jake Paul and Ben Askren. Ben Askren was just in there, like kind of just feeling it out, wasn't really putting any effort into his blocking or his footwork mechanisms of trying to mobilize himself in that ring. And then what happens? He gets caught. He gets hit because he's too relaxed. And that's literally the reason why Nate Diaz is both an exciting fighter, but at the same time, a fighter that will never reach a championship level, because there's just that one missing piece that was really exploited tonight by Jake Paul. And what was that? I urge you guys, after this particular video, to look at my prediction video for this fight. It is on the video section of my channel in this one right here, right? And by the way, don't forget to click and subscribe, like and subscribe. Help me become one of the biggest combat sports channels out there, so that we can give a different perspective in the media and in the MMA space, and create a great community of MMA enthusiasts and boxing combat sports enthusiasts around the world. Thank you. Like and subscribe. So carrying on with Nate Diaz, those are just the realities of his ceiling in the fight game. There's just no other way to really put it. He's an athlete. He's a triathlete, just like I mentioned. And I told you guys his brother swam Alcatraz in San Francisco. Do you guys understand how dangerous that is? First of all, there's sharks going on there. So not only are you dealing with the nerves of the danger of wildlife that maybe you may have no control, because look, if you're swimming in the San Francisco Bay Area in Alcatraz in a way that Nick Diaz did, those are one of the things that you have. And then you got to deal with the currents that's involved in that as well. I mean, look, I've swam in the currents of the American River a couple of years ago, almost drowned because I was trying to get to like one side of the river over the other, and then I had to go get back, and then I had to go swim to the other side. So then I had to fight through the currents of that. It is a very tough thing to do, and it wasn't even that long. Okay, it was just like at best not even a 25-yard football field, but the currents of it was just really strong. Now, take that into context with what Nick Diaz has done. Now, I know that's his brother. That's not Nate. Nate hasn't done anything extreme like that, but he's done triathlons just like his brother. And look, again, this is the problem: is that triathlons are not conducive for MMA. Okay, and there's a reason why I think Paul Felder did triathlons after he retired from MMA and probably never really delved in it while he was an MMA fighter because he knew that it's just look, it's just how long is a triathlon? Let's be honest, right? I've done a triathlon workout before where you're doing basically the same exact motion of, let's say, you're swimming a half a mile or 1 mile, and then the other thing that you do after that is you're doing a 14-mile bike ride, or what is it, maybe a 22-mile or something to that, and then you finish it off with a 7-mile run. Okay, I did a workout like that, and I tell you what, that whole entire workout at best took me like maybe 3 or 4 hours to complete. Is there anywhere in a sanctioned fight around the world that you're going to compete in as a professional athlete where you're going to fight somebody for 3 hours? Now, full disclosure, in MMA history, you had the likes of Sakuraba and Royce Gracie. One of their fights, they fought for 90 minutes in Japan in a no time limit because Royce Gracie talked to the Japanese commissions, if there was even such a thing now and before in that particular country of their MMA organizations or whatnot. But he requested for a no time limit or somewhere in between. It was like the time limit for each round was 90 minutes. So it was basically a 2-hour match in which it was just a huge stalemate for Royce Gracie and Sakuraba, right? Now, yes, if you're gonna if you're gonna fight in a situation like that, I guess that would be classified as valet judo. By the way, the same thing that Fabricio Verdum and Dos Santos are going to fight in under Jorge Masvidal's bare knuckle mixed martial arts card. Okay, and by the way, you heard me right. I said bare knuckle mixed martial arts card, so it's not like a BKFC or this and that. But nonetheless, if you're fighting valet judo, a triathlon is a good uh, cardio workout to train for. But the problem is, if you're fighting in MMA, if you're fighting in boxing, the most that you're going to fight in a championship round is none other than 25 minutes to 36 minutes, and that's it. You're not doing anything more than that. So, because of that, Nate Diaz is always going to look like the way that he does. Okay, he's going to look strong in the beginning, but then he's going to I'm sorry, he's not going to look strong in the beginning, but then he's going to look really strong in the end. And that's all that you can really get out of Nate Diaz because it's just the way that he trains. Look, the thing is that a lot of people always talk about, "Oh, well, I train hard," or "this guy trains hard," or this and that. Look, does Nate Diaz train hard? Yeah, he does. He trains hard. But the problem is, it's not about how hard you train, it's about how you train. Okay? And I think a lot of people really miss that concept sometimes. Now, is it hard to train for a 7-hour triathlon event? Yes. But you're not competing for 7 hours in a fight. It's not that type of event. It's not that type of muscle requirement or a muscle endurance requirement. Rather, it's not what it's about. So once again, if you're wondering why Nate Diaz doesn't knock people out, if you're wondering why Nate Diaz looks slow, or if you're wondering why Nate Diaz looks great in the later rounds while he's getting beat up, but then comes back in the end, especially when it's too late. There's a reason for that. It's the way that he trains. It's all of the above. It all correlates into one thing. It's the way that he trains. So, to all the fighters, if you're a young aspiring fighter that's listening to this right now, or if you're currently, competing, or if you're currently just getting into martial arts, or you're just getting into a boxing gym, or you're just getting into training for health, or this and that, or you just want to do it for self defense, more importantly, right? Because obviously you train martial arts and boxing, or forms of fighting arts to protect yourself, right? And you want to have the best results out of it. You want to be able to come out on top every time you're in a dire situation. I got to tell you, you got to do explosives. You got to do strength training, and then you got to combine all of them. Okay. Now, is it good that you can do, let's say, triathlons, or this and that? Yes, they're great, but it's very limited. Okay. So for now, I'd like you guys to like and subscribe. That's all that I have for this particular segment. I will be back to review the rest of the UFC. Like and subscribe, and enjoy the fights. Was it a good fight, or was it lackluster, or was it just everything in between? Right on the comments below. Let me know what you guys think.